Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Silver State, Nevada. Nevada's largest city, Las Vegas, is of course famous for its casinos and luxury resorts. The city itself actually has more hotel rooms than any other city in the world. I also recently learned that the city of Las Vegas consumes 60,000 pounds of shrimp every day, which is more than the rest of the United States combined. Nevada is also home to a government installation known as Area 51, which is shrouded in mystery. The area, several dozen miles north of Las Vegas, is rumored to be the site where some extraterrestrial life was discovered and studied, but more likely than not, it's just a more secretive weapons testing facility. However, if you want to learn more, do not try to drive to Area 51. You will be aggressively stopped and questioned. Nevada has 4 congressional House districts, and the current balance of power is 3 Democrats to 1 Republican. Only 2 of Nevada's 4 congressional House districts, I believe, could possibly be contested this November, and it is that 3rd and 4th district, which sit on either side of Las Vegas, and Nevada's 1st district, which covers most of the city and the Strip. So how have Nevadans been voting overall for House candidates over the last decade? Let's pull up a double line graph to figure that out. And looking at this data, we are looking here at a very competitive state between Republicans and Democrats at the House level, and to a higher degree at the presidential and senatorial and gubernatorial level as well, but we're not getting into all of those today. Basically here we have the expected ups and downs that coincide with presidential election years versus off-presidential years. And for the first half of the decade, we saw Republicans holding a very slight edge over Democrats. One of Nevada's previous senators, Republican Dean Heller, who was elected in 2012, enjoyed a very slim victory that year. And of course, he lost his re-election 2 years ago to Democratic Senator Jacky Rosen. That was 2018. 2018 is also the year that we saw Democrats really surpass Republicans in a more noticeable way. They slightly outvoted Republicans in 2016 at the House level, but really broke away more dramatically 2 years later, which is odd going from a presidential year to a midterm year, but well, that's what you get when you excite suburban voters, I suppose. Basically, the major takeaway from this is over the last decade, we see Democrats finally beginning to outpace Republicans in this very, very historically swingy state. All right, let's toss that graph aside and apply what we've just learned from it to Nevada's 3rd and 4th districts. They are both currently represented by Democrats. Both of them have representatives that are running for another term this year, and both of those Democratic representatives won very handily in their primaries this year in the state. I don't think either of them got fewer than about 75% of the vote count during their primaries when they're facing other Democratic challengers earlier this year. Republicans who are running for the seat, on the other hand, won their primaries by less impressive margins. I believe in the case of Nevada's 3rd, they received about 50% of the vote in their primaries. So carrying numbers like that into a general election against Representative Susie Lee of Nevada's 3rd might not be quite enough to win them the district. What they do have on their side, however, is the Cook PVI partisan lean score. It is Republican +2 when compared to the national average, meaning that it votes slightly to the right of the country as a whole. But considering that Susie Lee won pretty decisively 2 years ago by about a 9% margin of the vote in a district that is a Republican +2, I do believe she's going to be able to carry the district for a second time this year in a presidential year when voter excitement is going to be pretty high, especially in the areas in and surrounding Las Vegas, which is largely her district. Now, also talking about Nevada's 4th district, that covers northern Las Vegas as well as a lot of rural area. It reaches into the central part of Nevada, where of course it is much less populated. It's just mostly desert out there. This is a district that has a partisan lean of +3 into the Democratic column when compared to the national average, and has been represented by a Democrat for the last 4 years, or the last 2 terms. Current Representative Democrat Stephen Horsford was able to win pretty decisively by a very similar margin that Susie Lee enjoyed in Nevada's 3rd. He won by about an 8% margin of the vote, and also was able to win his primary very handily this year. And the total votes cast for Democrats in the primary in his district and in the 3rd district both favored Democrats in terms of raw numbers. So I do believe he's going to be able to retain his seat as well. At the end of the day, we have 4 U.S. House seats in Nevada that are not going to be changing parties, as I do not consider Nevada's 1st or 2nd to be competitive in any way at this point. So now we have those predictions in. Let's make them official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Until 2016, the state of Nevada has voted for the winning presidential candidate every year, going back all the way to 1980. So they voted for Obama twice, they voted for George W. Bush twice, Bill Clinton twice, etc., all the way back to Ronald Reagan's first term. However, as we know in 2016, they did vote for Hillary Clinton, sending their 6 electoral college votes to her, even though Trump obviously ended up winning the general, breaking a streak of over 30 years for Nevadans. How sad. Clinton's victory in Nevada wasn't so decisive, though. It was she carried the state by about 2.5% margin of the vote, which is a very, very slim margin, but not totally unexpected for a state as swingy as Nevada has proven to be over the last several election cycles. So how have Nevadans been casting votes for presidential candidates relative to the way they vote for House candidates? Let's pull up some voter turnout ratios right now to get some insight. Okay, and looking at these numbers, these are values that actually do play a pretty major role in determining how Nevadans might turn out for Joe Biden or Donald Trump this year. Because we see Nevada at the House level voting in pretty comparable numbers across parties, these presidential to House vote ratios really do serve as tiebreakers to determine, okay, if it's a tie at the House level in terms of raw numbers, how will those voters break for presidential candidates? And in the case of Barack Obama's second run in 2012, we saw him carrying the state's electoral college votes that year, even though there were more Republicans turning out for House candidates. But because Obama enjoyed a roughly 16% advantage in those voter ratios, he was able to narrowly carry the state of Nevada, I believe, by about 6 or 7%. Now, fast forward to 2016, we did see Democrats turn out in slightly higher numbers than Republicans at the House level, and on top of that, Hillary Clinton received just about 3.5% more points in her voter turnout ratio, which probably helped move her margin of victory from about 1% to about 2.5% or something. Overall, we do see Democrats with a bit of an edge in terms of presidential to House voter ratios, and these do matter, especially now that we saw 2 years ago Democrats really passing Republicans' raw numbers. It means Donald Trump is going to have a bit of a challenge ahead of him winning the state this year. So let's toss those numbers aside. We can use those to kind of project into how we think voters are going to turn out for presidents this year. Lastly, we do have to consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case, President Trump. And as of this video, it is not looking too good for him in Nevada. Honestly, he's at minus 22 points in the state. This will affect swing voters, independent voters, especially, obviously Democratic voters, and to a lesser degree, possibly some Republican voters. So now let's take everything we know about raw House turnout, where it's projected to be this year, compound that with the projected voter turnout ratios, as well as Trump's approval rating as of this video, give that all to Pollbot here to calculate how this is going to go down for Biden and Trump in under 3 months. Pollbot, let's calculate. And there's our result. We do have Joe Biden carrying the silver state by a 7.61% margin of the vote. This is an improvement on Hillary Clinton and a very, very similar margin to how Obama performed in the state 8 years ago against Mitt Romney. However, it falls well short of the numbers that Obama enjoyed 4 years prior to that when he was up against John McCain, and I believe he carried the state by over 10% margin of the vote. Basically here, we're returning to pre-2016 levels in the state. I think this is helped largely by the fact of the Democrats' very good showing in 2018. They were able to flip a governor's seat and a Senate seat, as well as show up in good numbers for their House candidates. All that combined with Trump's pretty poor approval rating in Nevada spells trouble for Trump and pretty rosy hopes for Joe Biden. So I think we can make this official now. Nevada going for Joe Biden this year. Let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So all the election results are in for the state of Nevada. There's nothing too shocking here, honestly. We do see somewhat expected improving numbers from Joe Biden upon Hillary Clinton. Let's talk briefly about the future of Nevada by looking at an old line graph and a new one as well. So let's first take a closer look at raw House turnout numbers in Nevada over the past decade. I love basing my calculations on these raw House turnout numbers because they provide such a good snapshot of how a state has been trending over the past several election cycles. And Nevada, I think, has one of the most clear-cut cases of improving prospects for Democrats. I mean, you do have slope values here, where the Democrats' value of 40.1 is nearly twice that of Republicans' 20.7. So basically, on average, every 2 years, Democratic House candidates running in the state have received 40,100 more votes than they did in the previous election cycle, meaning that Democrats' raw numbers are breaking away from those of Republicans by nearly 20,000 votes every 2 years, which is pretty significant for a state with only 6 electoral college votes. Also important to note is how Republicans were turning out in larger numbers in 2010, 12, and 14, but 2014 was the last year that happened. We saw Democrats turn out in larger numbers for House candidates very slightly 4 years ago, and then more significantly 2 years ago during the most recent midterm cycle. That strong showing from Democrats 2 years ago is the reason they were able to retain their seats and flip a Senate seat and flip a governor's seat, as the voters in this country continue to become more partisan and entrenched in their chosen parties. Next, I want to talk to you for just a second about this second graph. This is an estimated values for the rate of increase or decrease in those presidential to House voter ratios that I was using earlier. We see Republican values remaining largely unchanged going from 2012 to 2016 and projected into this year. And we do see downward sloping values going from 2012 to 2016, largely due to the fact that President Obama was a much more popular candidate overall in this country than Hillary Clinton was, and Nevada is certainly no exception to that rule, as it has usually, historically been a pretty good snapshot of where the electorate is as a whole. I mean, it did vote for every winning candidate going back to 1980, breaking that streak in 2016, of course. I don't think Joe Biden's voter ratio will be quite as low as Hillary Clinton's was. I do expect it to be over 100%, but not quite matching the levels of Barack Obama at his peak. Okay, let's toss all those graphs aside. I'll give you my final consensus on Nevada. It is becoming more Democrat and leaving behind its swing state status, its bellwether state status, if you will. I think it's pretty clear from the improvement in House turnout from Democrats over the last 10 years that a lot of voters in the state are breaking to the left. I blame that largely on the fast-growing city of Las Vegas. Since the last census, I believe Las Vegas population has expanded by about 15%. Probably a lot of those people moving into the city are younger people, a more diverse crowd, a more ethnically diverse crowd of people. The kind of folks that you would expect to lean more Democrat than Republican going into the future. Also important to note the fact that Nevada voted for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, when even though the country elected Donald Trump ultimately, means that Nevada may have left behind its bellwether state status, meaning we can look to Nevada to see how the rest of the country is going to go. It did break for a Democrat in a losing Democrat year, which just furthers my belief that it's becoming less swingy and much more Democrat. Republicans still do have a pretty considerable foothold in the state, especially in that second district, which covers Reno and Sparks and Carson City, but their influence is dwindling heading into the future. I think there's no doubt about that at this point. That just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter and update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date, so if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.